Well, there is a lot going on at the moment in Brussels and Strasbourg in terms of how European public affairs are regulated. It's a busy agenda. I would say there are three main items that are about to hit us and to affect the way that European parliamentarians and those interest groups that work with us will operate in the future. First of all, on the 23rd of June, so in a couple of weeks' time, we will be launching the so-called Joint Transparency Register between the Parliament and the Commission, which will form the basis of a registration system for all interest groups active on the Brussels scene. Secondly, in purely United Kingdom terms, we see the new Bribery Act come into force at the beginning of July, and this may or may not have implications for how British nationals operate in European public affairs in Brussels. Then thirdly, after the recent events to do with Sunday Times journalists operating a sting operation in Brussels, we are strengthening the code of conduct for members of the European Parliament. So if we have a look at each of those items perhaps in slightly more detail, but starting against the full background, because the real background to all this is really the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, which gives the European Parliament considerable powers in terms of a legislature. We are now a fully fledged international, transnational legislature. And many will argue that of the laws in the United Kingdom, more than 75% have their origin in European Union legislation, which has to be looked at, amended and voted upon by the European Parliament. That means that British MEPs are big players in terms of making legislation that affects global corporate and other interests. So we have to make sure that Europe's public and everybody else can have confidence in how that system works. And indeed it was interesting in terms of the Sunday Times operation that they chose in fact to highlight the powers that this Parliament has in order to show that it should work much more seriously in terms of policing its activities. So first of all, perhaps a little about the new Transparency Register that comes into force on the 23rd of June. It's a register operated between the European Parliament and the Commission, meaning that any interest representatives, be they commercial lobbyists or NGOs, academic bodies or others seeking to have influence on European public policy, will have to register on the joint register. There will be a common website where people can register, where there will be a declaration of what interests these groups have and an annual declaration to do with the amount of money that is being spent on lobbying. This actually puts the European Parliament streets ahead of most national parliaments in terms of the way we will be controlling lobbying. And let's be clear, these interest groups have to sign up to a code of conduct and there are sanctions. Sanctions which effectively mean if you break the code of conduct, you probably won't be allowed in to either the European Parliament or the Commission in future, not to mention the public comment about those who break the code. So that's the Transparency Register, and that's been something that now has been in preparation for some years and already in its nascent form has over 3,000, nearly 4,000 registrants, but that will really now, I believe, start to take off, and we have every indication that the Council, the Member States, will join us in that enterprise, and that ultimately, one day, I hope not too far soon, it will be a mandatory and not a voluntary register. But the other item that is about to hit us is, of course, the UK Bribery Act. It's slightly amusing, perhaps, from a Brussels perspective, If you look at the recent operation carried out by the Sunday Times, these were journalists who contacted, let's get it into perspective, 60 MEPs to try to get them involved in a consultancy and ultimately offering cash for amendments. Of the 60 that they contacted, 3 only took the bait. Now, I'm in no way proud of that, and that has to be dealt with. None of those 3, however, were British. If they had have been British and the Bribery Act had have been in force, the irony is that according to the terms of that act, the journalists would almost certainly have committed an offence, but the position of the MEPs is not so clear. It is an offence for a British national to try to corrupt or bribe a public official outside of the United Kingdom, but it's not so clear what the position is when that public official themselves is a United Kingdom national. And it is interesting that the Bribery Act mentions specifically members of the House of Commons, members of the House of Lords, but seems to have been a bit forgetful when it comes to members of the European Parliament. Maybe it's about time that they remembered our existence. So that's food for thought on that angle. But lastly, of course, and not just because of what happened with the Sunday Times, but because of our new powers under Lisbon, we in this Parliament have got to get serious about our own code of conduct for MEPs, because it's clear, whilst in comparison with our national counterparts on how we control lobbyists, we are at the top end of the scale, in other words, with having strong control. In terms of our members, in comparison, we are at the low end of the scale. But that too is about to change. We currently have a working group, which I am a member, and we are putting together a new code of conduct for members. Stronger regime of declaration of interests, backed up probably by some form of ethics committee. Anybody that works in the US will know the powers of the ethics committee in their setup, and also by stronger sanctions. And it may be indeed one day we will be looking for stronger criminal sanctions at a European level. It's difficult at the moment. Members are elected under their national law. They are accountable to their national electorates. So ultimately we always have to go back to the national authorities, which in this last case proved frustrating. So there are many developments, many things for public affairs consultants or those active on the Brussels scenes to be aware of, and plenty more to debate for the coming months and indeed years ahead.